Hello and welcome to the Old Fliers. In 1919, Australia's Prime Minister William Hughes offered a £10,000 prize to the first Australians to make the 17,700 kilometre long flight from England to Australia in 30 days or less. This was just 16 years since the Wright brothers proved flight was possible. One of the Australians' most decorated World War I pilots, Ross Smith, and his navigator brother Keith and two ace mechanics flew a Vickers Vimy to claim that prize. Now, American Peter McMillan and Australian Lang Kidby had the idea to build a replica Vickers Vimy and recreate that flight. Peter had been holidaying on Queensland Moreton Island when he met Lang. Lang sold him the idea of a flight from England to Australia in a replica, huge, lumbering 1919 Vickers Vimy bomber. All Lang needed was $1.5 million.
The lack of publicity that Ross has got, probably for the most important flight ever after the Wright brothers.
Peter was the man capable of raising those funds. Ross Smith had got his Vimy direct from the manufacturer. This aircraft was 6 tonnes, 13 metres long with a 20-metre wingspan. The twin-engine biplane was at the time a state-of-the-art heavy bomber. The replica would be built as close to the original as possible, from the hand-sewn cotton fabric on her wings to her steel bracing wire. Some changes were unavoidable. In place of the Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, which have not been made for 70 years, there would be 2 Chevrolet V8 racing car engines. To deal with air traffic controllers, who did not exist 75 years ago, radios and navigational equipment was added. Construction of the Vimy began in Australia. Soon it was realised that CASA bureaucracy would be a problem. So from March 1993, 2 workshops on different sides of the world were set up. Then in November 1993, Lang packed up engines, gearboxes, propellers and fuselage from Australia and consolidated the whole project in San Francisco. Lang had found the disused Hamilton Air Force Base where he could oversee the operational side of the project. He brought all components and workers together, creating the biggest home-built aircraft ever. Gradually the Vimy took shape and the first flight was achieved on July 30, 1994 by Lang and Peter Hoare, an English pilot who had flown a Vimy replica that had been built in the 60s in the UK. Sadly, that aircraft had caught fire during a refuelling accident shortly after construction. Then, on August 24, 1994, the Vimy and crew were transported to England in a US Air Force C-5 Galaxy. The build had taken 2 years and 20,000 man-hours to finish. The Vimy began its 75th anniversary trip to Australia on September 11, 1994, from the Farnborough Air Show. There were 14 people in the entourage, an Islander aircraft and an Australian Army Nomad flew support. The Vimy's throttle was pushed forward as a Qantas 747 did a low-level flyby. One small step for a 747 and one giant leap for a Vimy, the tower radioed. The route followed the original flight southeast across France, Italy and Greece to Egypt, east across Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman and Pakistan to India before turning south through Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore to Indonesia, then to Australia. The Smith brothers' flight took off on November 12, 1919. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and toothbrushes, the flight took off. Ross Smith and his crew headed towards France, facing a miserable mix of sleet and snow. This sort of flying is a rotten game, Ross wrote in his diary. Lang's flight ran into stormy weather over France as well. Fighting a strong headwind, they could only make 80 kilometres an hour. They were already behind schedule by the 3rd day when they reached Pisa in Italy. The sky brightened before we finally left Italy, and then Kidby took the wheel for the 320 kilometre crossing from mainland Greece to Crete As they made the descent into Cairo the next day, they were looking forward to seeing the pyramids from the cockpit of the Vimy. A misunderstanding almost got them shot down over Giza during a dawn tour of the ancient monuments. "You really stirred up a hornet's nest," said an Australian embassy official after the Vimy had landed. "What do you mean?" they asked. Air Defence Command had anti-aircraft weapons trained and ready to fire. "You're joking. We had permission to make that flight." Maybe so, but nobody told the officer commanding the restricted military area besides the pyramids. Lang and Peter alternated days in the pilot's seat, during which time they had to keep both hands on the wheel and both feet on the rudders for as long as 10 hours at a stretch. In the cramped cockpits, backs would ache and feet would fall asleep. To make matters worse, they couldn't hear each other over the deafening roar of the two engines and the whine of the propellers. They communicated by written notes. At Karachi, they learnt that the flight plan approved months before by the Pakistani authorities was no longer possible. Because of the tensions along the border with India, where the Pakistani army were conducting manoeuvres, air traffic control now required them to cruise at 21,000 feet to avoid trigger-happy soldiers. That was more than 5 times the altitude that the Vimy could reach with a full load. The authorities were studying a new route, but they had to coordinate everything with their Indian counterparts. "Why can't we just get on with it?" said Kidby. "They didn't have to put up with this in 1919. When Ross Smith and his team made the journey, their route had traced the outlines of the British Empire from Egypt to India to Australia. Lang's trip, by contrast, took them over 19 independent nations, each with their own security demands. Following some 9 hours of discussions, they eventually obtained approval to take the route to Delhi that avoided the military exercises. Shortly after sunrise the next day, they were back in the sky for a dawn flight over the Taj Mahal. Trouble with the starboard engine started a week before the Vimy broke down over Lampang province in Sumatra, and they belly flopped into a rice field 225 kilometres short of Jakarta. They had to repair the landing gear, straighten the collapsed tail strut, replace the starboard engine, and build an airstrip. A spare V8 engine was shipped from Australia, taking 8 hours to manhandle the new engine into place. As they left the coast of Timor behind, the last bit of green disappeared behind them. They were not looking forward to flying over the Timor Sea. A thin line appeared in the haze. Bathurst Island. "Yep," Kidby said. "Welcome to Australia." The Vimy made landfall over Darwin, Lang looking down on Fanny Bay, site of the Smith brothers' original landing so many years earlier. Vimy 1 cleared to land, the control tower told Kidby. "Welcome back to Darwin after all these years." They landed on Australian soil on October 22nd, taking 2 weeks longer than Ross Smith and his crew in 1919. Towards the end of this trip, Lang spent the long hours in the cockpit planning his next adventure. This would be a recreation of Bert Hinkler's solo flight from England to Australia, which he did 4 years later in a tiny original 1927 Avro Avian. Thank you for watching. Hit the like and subscribe button to encourage new content.